Hello, everybody. Professor Barth is here, Associate Professor of History at Arizona State University. Welcome to Foundations of Western Political Thought, Part 3 of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Today we're going to take a look at his second discourse on the origins of inequality. If you haven't seen the previous videos on Rousseau, go ahead and do so. I'm going to begin with a quote from Voltaire, Rousseau's contemporary, and this quotation comes from an essay that Voltaire authored a year before Rousseau's second discourse. Take a look at this. History in general is a collection of crimes, follies, and misfortunes, among which we have, now and then, met with a few virtues and some happy times, as we sometimes see a few scattered huts in a barren desert. As nature has placed in the heart of man interest, meaning selfishness, pride, and all the passions, it is no wonder that during a period of about 6 centuries, we meet with almost a continual succession of crimes and disasters. If we go back to earlier ages, we shall find them no better. Custom has ordered it so that evil has everywhere operated in a different manner. Voltaire's in the year 1754. Note how he puts the responsibility on nature. Nature has placed these vices in the heart of man. It's inherent in our nature. And if you go back to the earliest ages, you're going to find the same problems. Well, in Rousseau's Discourse on the Origin of Inequalities, sometimes known simply as the Second Discourse, Rousseau will present a radically different explanation and account of human development through history, and will argue, first, that man, in the state of nature, yes, he was primitive, but he was happy, healthy, good, and free. So you go back to the earliest stages, Rousseau says, and you don't find all the vices as Voltaire alleged. No, you find a happy, good, and free state of human nature. So what is to blame for evil? Who is responsible for all the vices and all the oppression that we see around us? It is society. Rousseau says society is to blame for human vices and for unnatural inequalities. And the first fatal step from this primitive and yet happy, healthy, good, and free state of nature to society and all the problems that come with it, the first fatal step was the introduction of private property. Private property, Rousseau says, was the source, the origin of the fall of man from this state of nature to this corrupt society. And then civil government arose not as a means to control or to subdue sin and vice and all the depravity of man. No, civil government, essentially, Rousseau says, arose as a conspiracy of the rich and the powerful to protect themselves, to aggrandize their own wealth, their own power. And so essentially what you have here, Rousseau says, is a fraudulent social contract. The second discourse. And like the first discourse, Rousseau authored this essay for an essay contest with the Academy of Dijon. And here was the prompt. What is the origin of the inequality among men? And is it justified by natural law? Rousseau begins the essay in the preface, and we'll just look at excerpts today, but again, we'll examine closely. The most useful and least improved of all human studies, Rousseau says, is, in my opinion, that of man. I therefore consider the subject of this discourse as one of the most interesting questions philosophy can propose. And unhappily for us, one of the most knotty that philosophers can labor to solve. This is not an easy subject, Rousseau says. For how is it possible to know the source of the inequality among men without knowing men themselves? One of the purposes of this essay, Rousseau says, we don't really understand natural man. We think we know natural man. We do not. We know man in society. Rousseau says, I want to know natural man. This is difficult. Rousseau says, how shall man be able to see himself such as nature formed him, in spite of all the alterations which a long succession of years and events must have produced in his original constitution? We are so far, so distant from natural man that it is difficult to see him for who he is. To consider human society with a calm and disinterested eye, it seems at first sight to show us nothing but the violence of the powerful and the oppression of the weak. You recall the quotation from Voltaire. You just look at history and they're like, well, obviously, human nature at its core, yes, there's beauty and intellect, and of course, but there's also just this innate corruption, this innate depravity about man. Rousseau says, yes, at first glance it would seem that way. It is only by taking a nearer survey of them, Rousseau says, and by removing the dust and the sand that surround and disguise the edifice, that we can finally perceive the unshakable basis upon which it stands, these human establishments, and learn to respect its foundations. Rousseau's going to go on that journey. I want to find original, natural man, and Rousseau believes that he has found it. But first we have to define our terms. What do we mean by inequality? And Rousseau says there are two types of inequality. One is natural inequality. The other is unnatural inequality. What is natural inequality? Well, natural inequality includes, as Rousseau sees here, you can see on the screen, age, health, strength, intellect. Rousseau believed it's just hardwired in the human beings that we're not exactly equal in all of these things. For example, there's a natural inequality between men and women in sports. It's not socially constructed, it's natural. And you could just come up with a legion of other examples, but there's also this other form of inequality, an unnatural inequality, and that's what Rousseau is going to attempt to explain in this essay. This unnatural inequality, or what Rousseau refers to as political inequality. Here, this depends not on nature, but Rousseau says, quote, it depends on a sort of convention or tradition, and is established or at least authorized by men's consent. It consists in the different privileges which some enjoy to the prejudice of the others, such as to be more wealthy, more honored, more powerful than they, or even to get themselves obeyed by them. So this unnatural inequality is socially constructed. That terminology wasn't around back then, but Rousseau may have as well have said it. And that's what he's seeking to explain here. The philosophers, Rousseau says, who have examined the foundations of society, have all felt the necessity of going back as far as the state of nature. But none of them has reached it. Think of if you follow the lectures in this series I've posted on YouTube, Foundations of Western Political Thought. If you've kept track with it, I mean, look, we've Locke, Hobbes. I mean, this theme of the state of nature, it's recurring. Rousseau says, but none of them have found it. They haven't actually gone back all the way. They haven't gone back all the way. There are certain presumptions that the philosophers have made. Presumption number one, that natural man, original man, had a real sense, a real notion of right versus wrong. Rousseau challenges that. Presumption number two, that in the state of nature, this original man had property rights, had this understanding of property or things that belong to him. Well, why do we presume that? Rousseau will also challenge that assumption and say, no, in the state of nature, actually, those ideas weren't around. Others still, Rousseau continues, after first granting to the stronger authority over the weaker, had government arise straight away, without giving thought to the time that must have elapsed before the language of authority and of government could have meaning among men. Many of these philosophers just assumed government came pretty rapidly. Rousseau says, I don't think so. I think it was a long, drawn-out process. Because the meaning of those words didn't exist in the vocabulary of man, of original man, of natural man, authority, government. Those are foreign, alien concepts to natural man. And finally, Rousseau says all of them, continually speaking of need, greed, oppression, desires, and pride, transferred, this is key, transferred to the state of nature ideas they had taken from society. They spoke of savage man and depicted civil man. What all these philosophers have done is they have observed man in society, civil man, and then they have assumed that those vices, those crimes, those depravities must have also existed in pre-civil man, in savage man, in original natural man. And Rousseau says, no. That is not the case. That is a faulty presumption. Now, in part one of this two-part essay, Rousseau will endeavor to prove 2 points. The first, he will distinguish man from beast. What is it what makes man different from animals? Rousseau will answer that. Number 2, Rousseau, in part 1, will assail Thomas Hobbes, the Hobbesian view of the state of nature. And he'll say, Hobbes is incorrect. That actually, man in the state of nature is untainted and uncorrupted. He is far from wicked, as Hobbes would have you think. So he begins by distinguishing between man and beast. He says, I see in any animal nothing but an ingenious machine to which nature has given senses in order to wind itself up and, to a point, protect itself against everything that tends to destroy or to disturb it. I perceive precisely the same thing in the human machine, but with this difference in man, that nature alone does everything in the operations of the animal, whereas man contributes to his operations in his capacity as a free agent. The one chooses or rejects by instinct, the beasts, the animals, the other, man, by an act of freedom. Beasts are enslaved to their instincts. Man is a free agent. As a result, Rousseau says, the animal cannot deviate from the rule prescribed to it, even when it would be to its own advantage to do so. While man often deviates from the rule of nature to his detriment. Thus, a pigeon was starved to death next to a bowl filled with the choicest meats, and a cat atop heaps of fruit or of grain, although each could very well have found nourishment in the food it disdains if it had occurred to it to try some. But it's not in their instinct. That pigeon isn't going to eat that meat. The cat's not going to touch that fruit or touch that grain, and so they'd rather starve to death than to violate the rule that nature has prescribed to it. What about man? Well, man, ironically, not only will man deviate from the rule as free agent, he can deviate from the rule for good, but he can also deviate from the rule to his detriment. Dissolute or indulgent men, Rousseau says, will abandon themselves to excesses which bring them fever and death. Man as free agent. Nature commands every animal and the beast obeys. Man experiences the same impression, but recognizes himself free to acquiesce or to resist. And it is mainly in the consciousness of this freedom that the spirituality of his soul exhibits itself, the power of willing, or rather of choosing. The beast doesn't enjoy this power, this faculty as free agent. Man does. It can work to his benefit. It can work to his detriment. There's another very specific property that distinguishes man and beast, namely the faculty of perfecting oneself. Whereas an animal is at the end of several months what it will be for the rest of its life, and its species is, after 1,000 years, what it was in the first year of those 1,000. Not so with man. We look at the history of man and look at all the improvements. It's amazing. There's this innate faculty of improvement, of perfecting oneself, owing, again, to man's, that property of being a free agent that the beast did not have. My wife and I recently got some chickens. We have almost a dozen of them. It's mostly, the wife and the kids will mostly deal with it, but we have a coop and all the rest. And it's funny just watching those chickens. I mean, you know, those chickens, once they're like 15 weeks old, I mean, that's what they're going to be like the rest of their lives. And then you look at a chicken in 2025, and a chicken in 2025, the year 2025, is no different than a chicken was 1,000 years ago, no different than a chicken 4,000, 5,000 years ago. Go all the way back as far as you want. Chickens haven't changed. A chicken today is like a chicken was all the way back in the times of, Caesar Augustus, and it's the same animal. Just no, not so with man, because again, man has this capacity, this faculty of perfecting oneself, and again, that can be for good or for ill. Here, Rousseau will look at how it can be for ill. Why is man alone liable to become an imbecile? Rousseau says. Is it not that he thus returns to his primitive state, and that whereas the beast, which has acquired nothing and also has nothing to lose, always keeps its instinct, man, losing through old age or other accidents all that his perfectibility had made him acquire, thus relapses lower than the beast itself. Man can improve himself to a great degree, or man can just plunge into the depths of depravity, and the word here, Rousseau says, just become an utter imbecile. That perfectibility, ironically, can also operate in the inverse. And so we just see these great, it's like pendulum swings in man. This distinctive and almost unlimited faculty, Rousseau says, is the source of all of man's miseries. It is the faculty which, over the centuries, causes his enlightenment and his errors, his vices, and his virtues, and eventually makes him his own and nature's tyrant. So, having established that, now Rousseau sets his sights on Thomas Hobbes. You'll remember we did a whole lecture series on Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes said, the condition of man is a condition of war of everyone against everyone. That's man in a state of nature. The state of nature without Leviathan, without government, without a common power to keep them all in awe. The state of nature is one of, quote, continual fear and danger of violent death. In the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Rousseau says, Hobbes, you've got it wrong. What you're describing, Rousseau says here, is man in society. Rousseau says, above all, let us not conclude with Hobbes that because natural man has no idea of goodness, man is naturally wicked, that he is vicious because he does not know virtue, that he always refuses to those of his kind services which he does not believe he owes them, or that by virtue of the right which he with reason assigns himself to the things he needs, he insanely imagines himself to be the sole owner of the entire universe. That was not natural man. Those are things that arose out of society. What Hobbes should have said was that, quote, since a state of nature is a state in which the care for our own preservation is least prejudicial to the self-preservation of others, it follows that this state, the state of nature, was the most conducive to peace and the best suited to mankind. To preserve himself, he didn't need to dominate others. There was no need to rule and oppress other people, Rousseau says in that state of nature. And so actually, far from being a nasty, poor, brutish, and short, far from that, actually, the state of nature was the most conducive to peace and the best suited to mankind. The reason why Hobbes said the opposite, Rousseau speculates, is that because Hobbes improperly included in savage man's care for his preservation the need to satisfy a multitude of passions that are the product of society. All of these passions that Hobbes said that natural man had to satisfy, those passions did not exist in natural man. And so he felt no need to satisfy them. It wasn't there. Hobbes did not see that the same cause that prevents the savages from using their reason at the same time prevents them from abusing their faculties. So that one might say that savages are not wicked precisely because they do not know what it is to be good. For it is neither the growth of enlightenment nor the curb of the law, but the calm of the passions and the ignorance of vice that keeps them from evil doing. So much more does the ignorance of vice profit these than the knowledge of virtue profits those. In other words, in this primitive state, in this state of nature, there was less reason to be wicked, and there was an ignorance of what wickedness even was. There was an ignorance of vice. There was an ignorance of evil and of evil doing. And because of that ignorance, man was better off. And because of that ignorance, man, in fact, in this natural state, in this savage state, was not wicked. There is, besides, another principle which Hobbes did not notice, Rousseau says, and which, having been given to man in order under certain circumstances to soften the ferociousness of his vanity or of the desire for self-preservation prior to the birth of vanity, tempers his ardor for well-being with an innate repugnance to see his kind suffer. There's something in natural man, there's something innate in man, Rousseau says, that Hobbes misses. It's a trait, a quality of natural man that softened, tempered some of these potential passions, the ferociousness, a quality that caused natural man to not wish to see his own kind, other men, suffer. What was that quality? Pity. I speak of pity, Rousseau says, a virtue all the more universal and useful to man, and so natural that the beasts themselves sometimes show evident signs of it. Pity. Natural man had pity. Original man in that state of nature had pity. What is pity? Well, if you look at, checked out the Oxford English Dictionary, here we have pity, the disposition to mercy or compassion. Mercy or compassion, mildness, tenderness and concern aroused by the suffering, distress, or misfortune of another, and prompting a desire for its relief, compassion, sympathy. Rousseau says that natural man, pre-civilized man, savage man, had pity. And Hobbes didn't see this. He was blind to it. Hobbes just assumed that they were, again, ambitious, power-hungry, just lustful, just wanting to acquire as much as they could. And Rousseau's, what are you talking about? That is not man in the state of nature. And what about this? Rousseau says there's plenty of evidence that natural man has pity. Even the beast sometimes show evident signs of it. Men would never have been anything but monsters if nature had not given them pity in support of reason. From this single attribute flow all the social virtues. Here's the natural goodness of man. In some sense, man, in Rousseau's telling, man in a state of nature exists completely outside of morality. He doesn't even understand. He has no knowledge of good and evil. And yet he does possess this element, this moral goodness of pity, this virtue, this moral virtue of pity. And from pity flow all the other social virtues. Indeed, what are generosity, clemency, humanity, if not pity applied to the weak, the guilty, or the species in general? Even benevolence and friendship, properly understood, are the products of a steady pity focused on a particular object. For what else is it to wish that someone not suffer than to wish that he be happy? Now, this identification must clearly have been infinitely closer in the state of nature than in the state of reasoning. Natural man was closer to this virtue. This is a natural virtue, pity. Therefore, natural man exhibited this virtue more than modern man. Reason, you're not going to get to this virtue of pity via reason. Here we see the romantic in Rousseau, so the post-Enlightenment era, even as Rousseau is writing during the Enlightenment. Look at this. It is reason that engenders vanity. It is philosophy that isolates man. It is by means of philosophy that he secretly says at the sight of a suffering man, "Perish if you wish, I am safe." Natural man would see somebody suffering. Savage man sees somebody suffering, Rousseau says, and just by instinct, by nature, wants to help that person. It is modern man. It is civilized man. It is by means of philosophy and reason that man concocts this excuse to not help his own. What is the philosopher? What can we say of the philosopher? One of his kind can with impunity be murdered beneath his window. He only has to put his hands over his ears and to argue with himself a little in order to prevent nature, which rebels within him, from letting him identify with the man being assassinated. Natural man wouldn't hesitate. He would go and help his fellow man. Civilized man said, la, 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 not going to pay attention, and excuses it. It comes up with all these reasons. Savage man has not this admirable talent, Rousseau says with some irony. And for want of wisdom and of reason, he is always seen to yield impetuously to the first sentiment of humanity. In riots and street brawls, the populace gathers, the prudent man withdraws. It is the rabble, it is the market women who separate the combatants and keep honest folk from murdering each other. Imagine Paris in 1755. You have a bunch of, some sort of riot or a street fight. The man of reason, the enlightened philosopher, would just kind of shirk back and withdraw into his own home. It's the market woman, it's the rustic peasant. That's the one who gets in there and keeps people from murdering each other, because it's that person, that more natural man or woman who still has those, who still respects those instincts that have been hardwired into people. It's philosophy that separates us from it. It is therefore quite certain that pity is a natural sentiment, which, by moderating in every individual the activity of self-love, contributes to the mutual preservation of the entire species. It is pity, which carries us without reflection to the assistance of those we see suffer. It is pity, which, in the state of nature, takes the place of laws, morals, and virtue, with the advantage that no one is tempted to disobey its gentle voice. It is pity, which will keep any sturdy savage from robbing a weak child or an infirm old man of his hard-won subsistence if he hopes he can find his own elsewhere. It is, in a word, in this natural sentiment, pity, that one has to seek the cause of the repugnance to evil doing, which every human being would feel, even independently of the maxims of education. Again, natural man was completely ignorant, Rousseau says, of right and wrong, of good and evil. Just ignorant. Nevertheless, this natural virtue of pity operated in man and kept him from doing evil, kept him from wickedness. Although Socrates, and minds of his stamp, may be capable of acquiring virtue through reason, mankind would long ago have ceased to be if its preservation had depended solely on the reasonings of those who make it up. With such sluggish passions and such a salutary curb, fierce rather than wicked, and more intent on protecting themselves from the harm they might suffer than tempted to do any to others, men were not prone to very dangerous quarrels. Yes, they wanted to protect themselves from harm and would do what they needed to do to achieve that. However, they weren't tempted to do harm to others just for the sake of it. They knew neither vanity, nor consideration, nor esteem, nor contempt, since they had not the slightest notion of thine and mine. There was no property in this day. Their disputes would seldom have led to bloodshed if they had had no more urgent object than food. Yeah, Rousseau's not denying that there wasn't bloodshed, by the way. But it wasn't of the wicked type. It was just men protecting themselves from harm. There was a certain innocence about it. It wasn't rooted in some of these passions that Hobbes had described in Leviathan. Let us conclude, part one. Rousseau says that wandering in the forest without industry, without speech, without settled abode, without war, and without ties, without any need of others of his kind, and without any desire to harm them, subject to few passions and self-sufficient, savage man sensed only his true needs. His intelligence made no more progress than his vanity. There was neither education nor progress. Generations multiplied uselessly, and as each one of them always started at the same point, centuries went by, and all the crudeness of the first ages. The species had already grown old, and man remained ever a child. And so Rousseau speculates that this was a long, long epoch, a long era, the state of nature, lasting far longer than the state of civil society. That this is man. None of the other philosophers have gone back this far, Rousseau says. I have, and what I've discovered is this. Man in this natural state, possessing this natural virtue of pity. As long as men remained satisfied with their rustic huts, as long as they undertook such works only as a single person could finish, and stuck to such arts as did not require the joint endeavors of several hands, they lived free, healthy, honest, and happy, as much as their nature would admit. Free, healthy, honest, and happy. That's the state of nature. This completely opposite from Hobbes's poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Or nasty, poor, brutish, and short. Free, healthy, honest, and happy. What do you think? In the comments below. Do you buy into this argument so far? What do you make of this account, this speculative account of human history? Is there something to it? Well, this Garden of Eden couldn't last long. It did. Excuse me. Let me rewind. It lasted a long time, but it wasn't permanent. Couldn't last forever, I should have said. Man, slowly through the centuries, perfecting himself. And now we come to part two. Part two. The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, to whom it occurred to say, "This is mine," and found people sufficiently simple to believe him. That man was the true founder of civil society. This is mine. Property. How many crimes, wars, murders, how many miseries and horrors mankind would have been spared by him who, pulling up the stakes or filling in the ditch, had cried out to his kind, "Beware of listening to this impostor." The man claiming that this is mine, who had put the stake in the ground and said, "This land right here, it's exclusively mine. Beware of this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the fruits are everyone's and the earth no one's." The advent of private property. Property ended the last stage of the state of nature. And so, Rousseau does not believe, and we see it here plainly, Rousseau does not believe that property is a natural right. Property is not a natural right. Rousseau rejects that Lockean principle, and in truth it predates Locke, but Locke is the one who's most famous for it. Remember, Locke said natural rights, life, liberty, and property. Rousseau does not believe property is a natural right. Rather, property is something that arises in society, and so it can't be a natural right. I've always found it interesting, of course, as many Americans have, that Jefferson altered Locke's that third right, life, liberty, property. Jefferson said, endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's not an insignificant change from property. Now, I don't know for certain that Jefferson read this essay. He did read Rousseau. He had a copy of Rousseau's Social Contract in his library. I suspect he probably read this essay at some point or another. But nonetheless, it's pretty striking. And I've argued before that in many, yes, Jefferson is a Lockean thinker, but there's definitely some Rousseau in Jefferson as well. Now, to be clear, Rousseau did not think that this could all just be undone, and that in the future man should eliminate private property altogether. Rousseau at no point in his writings, at least his public statements, ever endorsed anything like that. And there's no evidence that Rousseau supported the elimination of private property. What's done is done. Rousseau says we need to move on and create a new society via a proper social contract and through proper education, as we see in Emile. Nevertheless, this critique that Rousseau puts on private property, very, very influential. Very influential. Private property as the beginning of the fall. This is the origin of sort of the slide downward. And Rousseau's theory here inspired later socialists and communists who did, some of whom absolutely wanted to eliminate private property. But in all likelihood, Rousseau says, it wasn't just like one moment, one episode, and things were done. In all likelihood, things had by then reached a point where they could not continue as they were. For this idea of property, depending as it does on many prior ideas which could only arise successively, did not take shape all at once in man's mind. Much progress had to have been made. Industry and enlightenment acquired, transmitted, increased from one age to the next, before this last stage of the state of nature was reached. So, Rousseau gives this, embellishes this or dramatizes this episode in which a man put a stake in the ground, and then he later says, well, actually, this happened gradually. The onset of private property. But it is this in which society was born. Let us therefore take up the thread earlier and try to fit this slow succession of events and of knowledge together. So now, part 2, Rousseau will trace this development, this transition from the state of nature to society. State of nature to society. And he'll begin with Nascent Society. Beginning society, the earliest society. What did the earliest society look like? It must be noted, Rousseau says, that beginning society and the already established relations among men required in them qualities different from those they derived from their primitive constitution. Already, in the earliest societies, man is changing. Different rules are now governing man. Morality was beginning to enter into human actions. The goodness suited to the pure state of nature was no longer the goodness suited to nascent society. Punishments had to become more severe in proportion as the opportunities to offend became more frequent. Thus, although natural pity had already undergone some modification, this period in the development of human faculties occupying a just mean or average between the indolence of the primitive state and the petulant activity of our vanity must have been the happiest and the longest lasting epoch. This is interesting. So from Rousseau's vantage point, although he argues that pity operated most naturally in the pure state of nature, nonetheless, he says, it's this beginning society in which you have a balance between sort of that extreme primitive condition on the one end and the other extreme of just modern man trapped and enslaved by vanity and this constant need to impress others and to seek to advance oneself at the expense of others. What was the just mean, the balance? It was this era of beginning society, the earliest societies. And yes, natural pity had by this point undergone some modification, but it still operated strongly. In fact, the more one reflects on it, Rousseau says, the more one finds that this state, nascent society, was the least subject to revolutions, the best for man. This is the best state in Rousseau's mind. The best for man, in that he must have left it only by some fatal accident which, for the sake of the common utility, should never have occurred. Really, this should have been the resting point. Okay? If man had just kind of stopped here, said, all right, this is good. Now, in reality, because, as Rousseau explained earlier, man is free agent and has this faculty of perfecting oneself, man could not stop here. Man had this impulse to continue to improve and advance beyond this state. The example of the savages, almost all of whom have been found at this point, seems to confirm that mankind was made always to remain in it. That this state, nascent society, beginning society, is the genuine youth of the world, and that all subsequent progress has been so many steps in appearance toward the perfection of the individual and in effect toward the decrepitude of the species. So, what is he speaking of here with savages? The Native Americans was probably his foremost example. And Rousseau, although if I'm not mistaken, he never used the term noble savage. That concept of the noble savage originates from this idea that this was the balance, the just mean between the two extremes of like total state of nature, pure state of nature, and modern man. Mankind was made always to remain in it. But he doesn't. He advances toward civil society, propertied society. So, private property is introduced. Private property is introduced. From the cultivation of land, its division necessarily followed. And from property, once recognized, the first rules of justice necessarily followed. Oh, now you have private property, now you need laws. A whole host of new rules apply that didn't exist in that state of nature, maybe didn't even exist in the beginning society. Men begin to extend their views to the future. Oh, it's now possible to acquire possessions and to accumulate possessions. And all saw that they had some goods to lose. Property changes the whole game, the whole mindset. It is impossible to conceive the idea of nascent property in any other way than in terms of manual labor. It is labor alone which, by giving the cultivator the right to the product of the land he has tilled, therefore also gives him a right to the land, at least until the harvest, and so from one year to the next, which, as it makes for continuous possession, is easily transformed into property. Here, actually, Rousseau seems to agree with Locke's labor theory of property, the labor theory of property, and I have a whole video that I recorded last year on Locke's labor theory of property. I encourage you to watch it. Property, and then from there, metallurgy and agriculture were invented. Metallurgy and agriculture were the two arts whose invention produced this great revolution. It is iron and corn which have civilized men and ruined mankind. Iron and corn have civilized men and ruined mankind. The division of labor. The division of labor now fosters competition. Competition between man and man. Neighbors now begin to compare their abilities and their achievements and their property holdings one with another. Here then all our faculties developed, memory and imagination brought into play. Oh, now that you can acquire goods and accumulate them through hard work and creative skill, now your imagination begins going. Vanity increased. You're interested in things that in the state of nature you would have had no interest in, but now you're interested in them. Reason became active. And the mind, almost at the limit of the perfection of which it is capable, the mind's working in ways that it had not quite functioned in earlier stages. Here all natural qualities set in action, each man's rank and fate set. Not only in terms of the quantity of goods and the power to benefit or harm, but also in terms of mind, beauty, strength, or skill, in terms of merit or talents. Here we're seeing differences develop between man and man. And some of these are what, again, at the beginning of the video, were described as natural inequality. Some are stronger than others, some are smarter than others. And those begin to play a role in determining rank, determining the quantity of goods that one possesses. Some are more beautiful than others. Some have greater talents. And since these are the only qualities that could attract regard, one soon had to have them or to pretend them. This is key. Because in this new civil society, man is deeply concerned about recognition and about being esteemed by others. All of a sudden now, man's gaze is toward how do others perceive me? So one had to have these skills, these qualities, these traits, or to pretend them. This is where insincerity begins to develop. There was no insincerity in the state of nature. Now in civil society, vanity, insincerity, hypocrisy began to enter in. One soon had to have them or to pretend them. For one's own advantage, one had to seem other than one in fact was. Your true self now is being suppressed, is being disguised, and you're putting on a mask because that's how you advance in this new civilized society. To be and to appear became two entirely different things. And from this distinction arose ostentatious display, deceitful cunning, and all the vices that follow in their train. Do you see now why Rousseau says that Hobbes was ascribing vices that belong exclusively to civil man and wrongly ascribed those to savage man? Looked at in another way, man, who had previously been free and independent, is now, so to speak, subjugated by a multitude of new needs. These are needs that did not exist before. Now they exist, and man is subjugated by them, and there are a multitude. Subjugated by a multitude of new needs, and especially to those of his kind, whose slave he, in a sense, becomes, even by becoming their master. So Rousseau says even the rich and the powerful become enslaved by this system. Rich, he needs their services. He can't be rich without them. He's dependent on those he dominates, on those whom he oppresses. The poor, he needs their help. So rich and poor alike, all of a sudden now, are subjugated by these new needs. He therefore constantly has to try to interest them in his fate and to make them find their own profit, in deed or in appearance, in working for his. Everyone's trying to take advantage of one another, or to convince others to go in league with them for selfish reasons, in order to advance themselves in this new society. This makes him knavish and artful with some, imperious and harsh with the rest. Deceit, cunning, harshness, domination. These are new and novel traits in early civil society. Finally, consuming ambition, the ardent desire to raise one's relative fortune, less out of a genuine need than in order to place oneself above others. Savage man had no need for that, Rousseau says. Now that it's a factor. This is where you get ambition. Why did Hobbes think that existed in a state of nature? It didn't exist in a state of nature. It's part of civil society. It instills in all men a black inclination to harm one another, a secret jealousy, which is all the more dangerous as it often assumes the mask of benevolence in order to strike its blow in greater safety. Everyone's trying to one-up each other, going stabbing people in the back. And a word, competition and rivalry on the one hand, conflict of interest on the other, and always the hidden desire to profit at another's expense. All these evils are the first effect of property in the inseparable train of nascent inequality. There you go. The origin of inequality. What is it? It's property. Riches, before the invention of signs to represent them, money, could scarce consist in anything but lands and cattle. But when estates increased so much in number and in extent as to take in whole regions and touch each other, it became impossible for one man to aggrandize himself but at the expense of some other. And the majority of inhabitants who were too weak or too indolent to make such acquisitions in their turn were obliged to receive or force their subsistence from the hands of the rich. And hence began to flow, according to the different characters of each, domination and slavery, or violence and rapine. You have poor who are just trying to, in the midst of this competition, are unable to compete with the mighty and the powerful, and so they try to plunder the rich. So the rich, in a way, are endangered by this because the great masses who are in need of subsistence are compelled to seek to plunder the property owners. So it's just chaos. It's chaos. This is sort of akin to what Hobbes was describing. Okay, this state of war. This right here. There it is. A war of all against all. War of everyone against everyone. Now we finally reached it, but no, it's not the state of nature. This is society, and it's leading to total chaos. For rich and poor alike, the rich aren't doing well in this either. They're in constant fear of being attacked for their wealth. Thus, as the most powerful or the most miserable claimed, on the basis of their strength or of their needs, a kind of right to another's goods, the breakdown of equality was followed by the most frightful disorder. Thus, the usurpations of the rich, the banditry of the poor, the unbridled passions of all, stifling natural pity. See, now that natural virtue it's no longer in operation like it used to be. And the still weak voice of justice made men greedy, ambitious, and wicked. Now we've arrived at that stage. A perpetual conflict arose between the right of the stronger and the right of the first occupant, which ended only in fights and murders. Nascent society gave way to the most horrible state of war. War of all against all. Mankind, debased and devastated, no longer able to turn back or to renounce its wretched acquisitions, and working only to its shame by the abuse of the faculties that do it honor, brought itself to the brink of ruin. After all this time, all this development over human history, the great bulk of which was peaceful until that fateful choice, the advent of property, now humanity is brought to the brink of ruin. The rich, above all, must soon have sensed how disadvantageous to them was a perpetual war, of which they alone bore the full cost. The poor had nothing to lose in this. The rich had everything to lose in this state of war, of all against all, in which everyone risked his life while only some also risked goods. They realized, that is, the rich, well enough that they were only based on a precarious and abusive right. Again, going back to this idea of Rousseau's that there is no natural right to property. They had no natural right to these possessions. And that since they had been acquired solely by force could deprive them of that property without there having any reason for complaint. So the property was acquired by force, Rousseau says. Again, you see the influence on socialism later. Again, Rousseau's not a socialist. However, you see how the influence. The origin of property, Rousseau says, is based on force. It's not legitimate, actually. And because of that, force could also deprive the property owner of that property, and they would have no reason to complain. Even those whom industriousness alone had enriched could scarcely base their property on better titles. Yeah, you may say, well, I worked hard for my property. I earned it. I didn't steal it from others. I didn't use force. So it says, no, you still don't have a natural right to it. You still don't have a natural right. Property is not a natural right. No matter if they said, it is I who built this wall. I earned this plot by my labor. Well, who set its boundaries for you? They could be answered. Do you not know that a great many of your brothers perish or suffer from need for what you have in excess, and that you required the express and unanimous consent of mankind to appropriate for yourself anything from the common subsistence above and beyond your own? Boy, Rousseau just really takes a cudgel to this notion of private property. For the record, I disagree very much with this explanation of private property. My view of property is very closely aligned with Locke's. Again, watch that video I recorded last year, Locke on the labor theory of property. I think Locke makes a pretty darn convincing case for a natural right in property. And so I'm on Team Locke in this. But here's Rousseau. It's not legitimate. It's not legitimate. It required the express, and look at that, and unanimous consent of mankind in order to appropriate for yourself this property. Especially while others perish or suffer from need. You have excess. You have the means. And others are suffering again, that natural virtue of pity. But Rousseau says that natural virtue of pity is no longer in operation because we're no longer in a state of nature. By the way, please comment below. Comment below. Libertarians, comment away. Go for it. Defend the right of private property against Rousseau. Progressives, socialists. I know some of you are watching. Comment below and defend Rousseau. Defend it. It's an interesting question. This question, is property a natural right? And Rousseau takes a very definite stance in the negative. Lacking valid reasons to justify and also lacking sufficient strength to defend himself, because here's this landowner, this property owner, and he's surrounded by bandits, crushed by troops of bandits in this war of all against all, and unable because of their mutual jealousies to unite with his equals against enemies united by the common hope of plunder. He's unable because he has this competition with other property owners, and then meanwhile there's the masses who are rising up against them. The rich, under the pressure of necessity, at last conceived the most well-considered project ever to enter man's mind. Well, what is this? What is Rousseau? What's coming next? What are the rich going to do? How are they going to survive this war of all against all? After exhibiting to his neighbors the horror of a situation which armed all of them against one another, made their possessions as burdensome to them as their needs, and in which no one found safety in either poverty or wealth. Nobody's safe here. The poor aren't safe. The rich aren't safe. He easily invented, this is the rich man, easily invented specious reasons to bring them over to his purpose. Oh, here comes the deceit, the cunning. Let us unite, he told them, to protect the weak from oppression, restrain the ambitious, and secure for everyone the possession of what belongs to him. Let us institute regulations of justice and of peace, to which all are obliged to conform, which favor no one and which, in a way, make up for the vagaries of fortune by subjecting the powerful and the weak alike to mutual duties. In a word, instead of turning our forces against ourselves, let us gather them into a supreme power, Leviathan, that might govern us according to wise laws, protect and defend all the members of the association, repulse common enemies, and keep us in eternal concord. This, right here, is the birth of the state. The state. It's a fraudulent social contract, one based on deceit, a conspiracy of the rich to preserve themselves and their privilege, safeguarding it against revolt, against plunder, and preserving themselves. Much less than the equivalent of this discourse was needed to sway crude, easily seduced men who, in any event, had too much business to sort out among themselves to be able to do without arbiters, and too much greed and ambition to be able to do for long without masters. So again, Rousseau here, like the early example of the man who put the stake in the ground, this dramatized event, Rousseau says, look, in reality, it wasn't just this one discourse that did it. This was sort of evolved in this direction. All ran toward their chains in the belief that they were securing their freedom. For a while they had enough reason to sense the advantages of a political establishment, They had not enough experience to foresee its dangers. They didn't foresee how the state, civil government would be abused and would be used by the rich and the powerful, by the privileged, by those who benefit from unnatural inequality to preserve their privilege, to preserve their unnatural gains, and to dominate others. There was no experience from the past to allow them to foresee those dangers. And those most capable of anticipating the abuses were precisely those who counted on profiting from them. Isn't that interesting? So there were men who could possibly foresee abuses, but those are the ones who are aiming to participate in that abuse. And even the wise saw that they had to make up their mind to sacrifice one part of their freedom to preserve the other, as a wounded man has his arm cut off to save the rest of his body. There's your social contract. Such was, or must have been, the origin of society and of laws, which gave the weak new fetters and the rich new forces, irreversibly destroyed natural freedom, forever fixed the law of property and inequality, transformed a skillful usurpation into an irrevocable right as property, and for the profit of a few ambitious men, henceforth subjugated the whole of mankind to labor, servitude, and misery. There's your origin of inequality. Societies once formed in this manner soon multiplied and spread to such a degree as to cover the face of the earth. And you fast forward all these centuries and millennia later, and here we are in the 21st century. The Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. Well, returning to Voltaire. Voltaire received a copy of this essay, and he replied to Rousseau in a letter written August 30th, 1755. I have received, sir, your new book against the human species. No one has ever been so witty as you are in trying to turn us into brutes. To read your book makes one long to go on all fours. Since, however, it is now some 60 years since I gave up the practice, I feel that it is unfortunately impossible for me to resume it. You gotta admire the wit of Voltaire, who was, I think he was around 60 years of age at that point. He continues. I agree with you that science and literature have sometimes done a great deal of harm. Galileo's enemies kept him languishing in prison at 70 years of age for the crime of understanding the revolution of the earth, and what is still more shameful, obliged him to forswear his discovery. Great crimes are always committed by great ignoramuses. What makes, and will always make, this world a vale of tears is the insatiable greediness and the indomitable pride of men. Letters support, refine, and comfort the soul. They are serving you, sir, at the very moment you decry them. You are like Achilles, declaiming against fame, and Father Malebranche, using his brilliant imagination to belittle imagination. The irony here of Rousseau, of all people, decrying philosophy and civilization. Well, If anyone has a right to complain of letters, I am that person. For in all times and in all places they have led to my being persecuted. Still, we must needs love them in spite of the way they are abused. He's talking about civilization, civilized society. As we cling to society, though the wicked spoil its pleasantness, as we must love our country, though it treats us unjustly, and as we must love and serve the Supreme Being, despite the superstition and fanaticism which too often dishonor his service. Just because something has been abused, it doesn't mean you throw the baby out with the bathwater. Voltaire tells Rousseau. So, this discourse on the origin of inequality. Now, I want to close today by comparing Rousseau's account to the account of creation in the book of Genesis. Because at first glance, one might think, well, Rousseau here, he's denying that man is naturally sinful. He's denying the doctrine of total depravity, the depravity of man, this innate depravity of man that we see in Hobbes. And so this would appear to contradict the Christian doctrine. I mean, Christianity absolutely does not teach that man is inherently or naturally good. However, if you compare the Genesis account of creation and the fall of man to Rousseau's, there are some interesting overlaps. So, a way of review. On the sixth day, God created the animals, every kind of cattle and creeping thing, every beast upon the earth. And then God said on that sixth day, let us make man in our image, that is in the likeness of God himself. Man is the only creature made in the image of God. That is what distinguishes man from beast. Man was formed out of the dust, and God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. The man's name was Adam, which means man or mankind. Then Eve was made from the rib of Adam, Eve meaning the mother of all life. And God charged Adam and Eve, be fruitful, multiply, eat fruits, plants, and seeds. This was the original state of nature. And God gave man dominion as authority. Man had natural authority over all the creatures on the earth. Man was still subordinate and answerable to God. The creature is lesser than the creator. But man had dominion over the earth. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Very good. The Garden of Eden, the original man in that original state of nature, and they were naked and were not ashamed. Rousseau might call them savage. They didn't even know they were naked. And they did not know right from wrong, virtue from vice. And God placed Adam and Eve in the garden and charged them, again, be fruitful and multiply, dress it and keep the garden. A great river went out and watered the garden, and there grew every good tree that was good for food. The tree of life was there, but also there was another tree. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Genesis chapter 2, verse 16, and the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it, For in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Have you ever thought about what that means? To remind you, what did Rousseau say? The ignorance of vice profits the savage more than the knowledge of virtue profits the civilized man. The knowledge of good and evil. Man in the state of nature, according to Rousseau, lacked this knowledge. In Genesis, we find that man lacked this knowledge. And God commanded them very explicitly, do not eat of this tree. Chapter 3. Now the serpent was more subtle, it is crafty, than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, did God actually say, you shall not eat of any tree in the garden? Now this was a ridiculous question, and the serpent understood and knew very well that it was a deceptive question. God did not command that they may not eat of any tree. In fact, God commanded almost precisely the opposite. You may eat of any tree. You are only prohibited from eating of this tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But the serpent asked this question. Did God really say you shall not eat of any tree in the garden? This he asked Eve. The woman replied, we may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, nor shall you touch it, lest you die. But the serpent said to the woman, you will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Now, right then and there, what Eve should have done was run, get her husband, then Adam should have taken some implement or whatever and just clubbed the serpent over the head with it, or just strangled him for daring to rebel against the creator of the universe. But that's not what happened. The text continues. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. It's the account of creation, the creation of man, of Adam and Eve, and of the fall. So, what do we have here compared to Rousseau? First of all, of the commonalities, we have a prelapsarian paradise. A prelapsarian paradise. And not only is it a paradise, but it's a paradise in which the knowledge of good and evil does not exist. There's an ignorance of vice. And this other commonality, we have a fall. There is no fall in Hobbes. Hobbes says he goes all the way back, and all the way back you have depravity. Here we have a fall. In Rousseau, we have a fall. But there are some key differences, critical differences. In the Genesis account, society is not responsible for the fall. Man is responsible for the fall. And not just man, but the first man. Like the first man is responsible for the fall. And in fact, he willed it. He freely willed it. This wasn't society. Society is not to blame. It was a free act, an act of a free agent. Rousseau has that right. Man's a free agent who willfully disobeyed God and ate of the tree. It's not society's fault. That of all things is the greatest difference. And then civil government comes about not as a conspiracy of the rich and the powerful, although to be sure it's abused by the rich and the powerful for their own purposes, but the original intent of civil government is that it is now necessary to restrain those wicked passions that now do innately and naturally belong to man. So there's a prelapsarian natural man, and then there's a post-lapsarian, post-fall man, and man on the other side of the fall is naturally depraved, is naturally wicked. Yes, there are qualities that temper that wickedness and that depravity, but man is now radically corrupt innately after the fall. And so that's the other difference too, that there's this like seismic shift in the nature of man, prelapsarian, postlapsarian. So just an interesting aside that I find it interesting to compare and contrast, find some overlap. Ultimately, another weak point of Rousseau's argument: what is society? Society is not, an autonomous agent. Society cannot, doesn't have a will of its own. Society is made up of individuals. It's composed of men. And so how can you reason that the corruption begins with society when all that society is a collection of men? And so that's another weakness in Rousseau's account, in my opinion. And I could elaborate more on that, but this is already quite a lengthy video. Thank you for watching. If you've watched the entire thing, I want to hear what you think below. I love this. This second discourse is great. Again, I have some fundamental disagreements with it. It's a great read. It's brilliant. And it's not Rousseau's most famous work, but it's I don't know. I think it might be peak Rousseau, or it's right up there. Now, Rousseau. From here, the question is, well, is it possible now for there to be any other kind of society? Because again, you may remember from part 1, I said Rousseau isn't arguing that we ought to return to the woods, okay, and become primitive man again, and that's not happening. So the question that then begs the question: is there a way to fix this? And Rousseau says yes, there is. And again, it's social transformation. He's going to propose an answer. And as it so happens, both answers come in the year 1762, 7 years after he authors this discourse. He proposes an answer in Emile, which is on education, how to create this new man from child to man, how to educate them properly. We're not going to have a distinct video on that. I covered a little bit of that in part 1. Then also, as regards to civil government, the social contract, which is also published in 1762 on the social contract, civil government. And Rousseau believes that there's a way to create a legitimate social contract, not the fraudulent social contract that arose initially, but a new social contract grounded in the general will. And so we will explore that in part 4. See you then. Bye.